Between roughly 1750 and 1900, the Royal Navy lost more men to scurvy than to combat, not because the cure was unknown, not because nobody had looked. In 1753, James Lind published the result of a controlled trial that proved citrus fruit reversed scurvy in less than a week. The knowledge sat on shelves, got misapplied, got diluted, got boiled into uselessness by administrators trying to cut costs, and by the time Antarctic expeditions of the early 1900s sailed out carrying the Navy's own official remedy, men were still dying of the same disease on the same ships. Vitamin C would not be isolated until 1932. So for 180 years, the answer existed and did not save anyone. How does that happen? George Anson left Portsmouth in September of 1740 with 6 ships and roughly 1,900 men. He came home nearly 4 years later with 1 ship and 188. Do the arithmetic. 80% of those men were gone. The Spanish, who Anson had sailed to fight, killed almost none of them. The thing that killed them had no cannon. It didn't board. It didn't chase. It simply waited, the way it always waited, for the 6-week mark. Right around week 6 at sea, without fresh food, the human body begins to come apart. Wounds that had healed years before would reopen. Gums would blacken and swell until men couldn't eat. Bones that had knit together after old fractures would refracture, spontaneously, in the night. Men who had been walking would be dead inside a week. The sailors called it scurvy. They had called it that for 200 years. There was nothing mysterious about the symptoms. Every experienced officer in the Royal Navy had seen them. The disease was not exotic, not new, not poorly described. It was simply, reliably, lethally routine. By the time Anson's squadron crossed the Pacific on the Centurion, the ship was down to so few living men that they couldn't work the sails properly. Think about what that means. A fully rigged warship of that era needed hundreds of hands to function. The men still on their feet were sailing through the largest ocean on Earth undermanned, watching their crewmates die, knowing they likely did not have enough people left to make port if conditions turned. Bodies were going over the side faster than ceremony allowed. There wasn't time for full burial rites. The dead were becoming a logistical problem. And here is the thing that should make you furious. The answer already existed. Not a rumor. Not a folk remedy passed between fishermen. A documented, repeatable, observable cure. Sailors who were given citrus fruit recovered. Surgeons had written it down. The evidence was sitting in the records of the Royal Navy itself, accumulating in voyage reports and medical journals for decades. In 1753, a Scottish physician named James Lind would publish a controlled trial, one of the earliest in medical history, demonstrating exactly what prevented and cured the disease. The Navy would read it, acknowledge it, and then do almost nothing about it for the better part of a century. Anson's voyage was not the beginning of this story and not the end. It was the point where the scale of the catastrophe became impossible to look away from. 1,700 men. Not sunk. Not captured. Quietly, systematically, needlessly dead. The question that drives everything that follows is simple. How do you lose the cure? The smell came first. That was how the men who survived described it. Something sweetly wrong, like meat beginning to turn. It came from the sick bay, and then it came from everywhere, because eventually the sick bay was most of the ship. Scurvy is not a fever. It is not an infection. It does not attack the body from outside. What it does is stop the body from holding itself together. The mechanism is this: every structure in the human body that requires strength, the walls of blood vessels, the tissue binding muscle to bone, the scaffolding that keeps old wounds closed, depends on a protein called collagen. And collagen cannot be built or maintained without vitamin C. Take away the vitamin and the body does not pause. It continues, consuming itself, dismantling its own repairs. Within weeks, the architecture fails. You could watch it happen by stages. First, the exhaustion so deep men could not lift their arms. Officers mistook it for insubordination. Some captains ordered floggings for men physically incapable of standing watch. The lash fell on bodies already breaking open from within. Then the gums. They blackened and swelled and pulled back from the teeth until a man would close his fist around a tooth that had been firmly rooted in his jaw the week before. It dropped into his palm. Then the old wounds. A sailor who had broken his leg falling from a yardarm 8 years before would feel it go again in the night, the long-healed fracture splitting apart as though the bone had never mended. The body was rescinding its own history. The food guaranteed it. Salt beef, so hard it could be carved into ornaments. Biscuit wrapped sharply on the table before eating. Not from ceremony, but to knock out the weevils. Water stored in wooden casks until it went green, until it moved on its own. There was no vitamin C in any of it. Not a trace. Not for weeks on end. Not for months. The body, given nothing to work with, simply stopped being able to build itself, stopped being able to maintain what it had already built. 600 years of maritime history and the sea had found a way to make men dissolve slowly from the inside out. One thing reversed it. Only one thing. And the men dying in Anson's hold were within reach of it, if anyone had known where to look. Richard Hawkins wrote it down in 1593. Citrus fruit, he said, was a certain remedy for scurvy. He had watched sick men recover on it with his own eyes. The Portuguese had known it for decades before him. Dutch traders in the East Indies carried lemons as a matter of routine. The evidence was sitting in the logbooks, in the sailing records, in the lived experience of thousands of sailors across 2 centuries. None of it moved medicine. Not 1 degree. The reason was the theory. In the 18th century, scurvy was understood as a corruption of digestion, a kind of internal rot caused by damp air, idleness, bad salt meat, the general foulness of shipboard life. The body was putrefying from within. That was the framework. And once a framework is in place, it does not simply accept new information. It digests it, bends it, makes it fit. When a crew recovered after eating oranges, physicians did not conclude that oranges contained something essential. They concluded that fresh food had stimulated the digestion and temporarily slowed the rot. The citrus was a tonic, a pleasant one, not a cure, not a mechanism, just one item on a long list of plausible interventions. That list included vinegar, elixir of vitriol, which was diluted sulfuric acid, wort of malt, fresh seawater. Each one was treated as equally credible because the theory offered no way to tell the difference between them. There was no concept of a specific nutritional deficiency, no framework that would allow anyone to ask what citrus contained that vinegar did not. The question was invisible. The theory had already answered it. So the correct observations kept arriving, logged and filed and quietly buried for more than 200 years. Hawkins, the Dutch, the Portuguese, The answer was in the record. But the record was being read by men who already knew what caused scurvy, and that certainty was more durable than any stack of recovered sailors. What finally forced the question open was a disaster so enormous it could not be theorized away. In May of 1747, James Lind, a ship's surgeon aboard HMS Salisbury, did something no naval physician had done before. He made it a fair fight. 12 sailors. All of them had scurvy. Lind put them in the same quarters, fed them the same base diet, and then divided them into 6 pairs. Each pair received a different treatment. Cider, vinegar, diluted sulfuric acid, seawater, a paste of garlic and mustard, and for the last 2 men, oranges and lemons, 2 of each per day. Within 6 days, the 2 men on citrus were fit for duty. One returned to nursing the others. The others were still dying. By any modern measure, this was the answer. 6 pairs, 1 variable, 1 decisive result. Lind had run one of the first controlled clinical trials in the history of medicine, and the trial had spoken clearly. Citrus prevented scurvy, not as one option among many, as the only option that worked. Then Lind wrote it up, and everything went wrong. In 1753, he published a treatise on the scurvy. 400 pages. The trial is in there, documented and accurate, but it is buried inside a text that also argues at length that scurvy is caused by blocked perspiration and putrefying humors. Lind still believed the old framework. He could not abandon it, because the framework was the only logic he had. So he interpreted his own result through it. Citrus, he concluded, helped open the pores and cut through the body's accumulated corruption. It was useful. It was one of the better remedies on his list. His list still had other items on it. The right answer went into print attached to the wrong reason, and that was fatal to its chances. A result tied to a false mechanism has no defense. Physicians who rejected the mechanism could reject the result with it. A correct finding buried in 400 pages of humoral theory is not a discovery. It is a document waiting to be ignored. For another 40 years, the Royal Navy continued to lose men to scurvy at the same catastrophic rate. Lind's trial sat in the literature, perfectly preserved, perfectly invisible. The question now was who would finally force the answer through. Gilbert Blaine did not guess his way to the answer. He counted. In the 1780s, serving as physician to the fleet in the West Indies, Blaine kept meticulous records of every sailor who got sick, every sailor who died, and what they died of. He was cold-blooded about it in the best possible way. He wanted numbers, not theories. What he found was straightforward and brutal. Scurvy was killing and incapacitating men at a rate that dwarfed enemy action. The Royal Navy was defeating itself. Blaine pushed. He lobbied the Admiralty for years, compiling mortality tables, citing Lind's trial, translating the data into the only language naval administrators truly spoke: cost, capacity, and fighting strength. In 1795, 42 years after Lind first published, the Admiralty finally ordered lemon juice as a standard issue ration for the fleet. Mixed into the daily grog. Non-negotiable. The results were almost violent in their speed. At Haslar Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, scurvy admissions had run into the thousands every year. Within a few years of the order, that number collapsed to a handful. The sick lists across the fleet shrank so fast that commanders wrote back to London in something close to disbelief. Ships that had once needed to break off station every few weeks to put sick men ashore could now stay at sea for months without losing their crews. That changed everything about the Napoleonic Wars. The Royal Navy could now maintain a continuous close blockade off Brest and Toulon, keeping the French fleet pinned in harbor for years on end. Not weeks. Years. Napoleon could plan his invasions, marshal his troops, and mass his transports, but he could not move without naval cover, and the ships that would have given him that cover could not leave port without facing a British squadron that simply refused to go home. The blockade that strangled French sea power was built, in no small part, on lemon juice. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Nobody in the Navy knew why it worked. They knew that it did. They had the data and they had the results, and that was enough to act on. The mechanism, the actual biology of vitamin C and collagen synthesis, was still a century and a half away. They had the cure without the explanation. Which raises the question of how many other cures were still out there, waiting for someone to count carefully enough to find them. In 1860, the Royal Navy switched suppliers. The reason was empire and arithmetic. Mediterranean lemons came from Sicily, from groves the British did not own, paid for in foreign coin. West Indian limes grew on Montserrat and Dominica, British islands, British labor, British profits. The lime juice cost less and kept the money inside the empire. On a spreadsheet, it was an obvious decision. Nobody stopped to check whether a lime was a lemon. They assumed it was. The words had been used loosely for decades. Citrus was citrus, and besides, the ration had been working. Sailors were not dying of scurvy. The Navy had the data to prove it. So the Sicilian lemon contracts quietly expired, the West Indian lime contracts replaced them, and the logbooks kept recording the daily issue exactly as before. What the logbooks did not record was that a lime carries roughly a quarter of the vitamin C of a lemon. And what nobody knew, because the chemistry had not yet been worked out, was that boiling the juice for storage and pumping it through copper piping destroyed most of what little remained. By the time the ration hit a sailor's tongue, it was effectively inert. The ration was still issued, still logged, still swallowed. It no longer worked. For a while, the failure stayed hidden. Steam power had replaced sail, and steamships crossed the Atlantic in days rather than months. Voyages were simply too short to show the symptoms. Scurvy takes weeks to develop. If no passage lasted long enough for the disease to emerge, there was nothing to contradict the assumption that the lime juice was doing its job. The Navy congratulated itself on a system that was functioning perfectly. It was not functioning. It had been hollowed out from the inside, and no one could see it because the conditions that would expose the failure had not yet arrived. They would arrive. In the 1880s and 90s, British polar expeditions began pushing into the Arctic and Antarctic on ships that sat locked in ice for months at a time. The old enemy had a window again. What happened next would not just embarrass the Navy. It would kill some of the most celebrated explorers in British history. The Nerez Arctic expedition left Portsmouth in May of 1875 with lime juice in the hold and total confidence in its medicine chest. George Nares commanded two ships, HMS Alert and HMS Discovery, pushing further north than any British expedition before them. Within months, scurvy had crippled his men. Not a few sailors. Nearly half the crew. Men whose teeth loosened, whose legs turned black, who could not stand their watch. The expedition limped home in 1876, and the question started immediately. How had it happened? the lime juice had been issued. The logs proved it. The Navy's answer was almost impressively wrong. It wasn't the lime juice, they decided. It couldn't be the lime juice. The problem was the tinned meat. The men had eaten tainted provisions, absorbed some poison from the cans, and that poison had expressed itself in symptoms that merely resembled scurvy. A theory called ptomaine poisoning, the idea that rotting organic matter produced a toxic chemical that corrupted the blood, fit the evidence neatly enough that it became the preferred explanation. It had the additional convenience of not implicating the Navy's standard issue remedy. Inuit hunters living in the same Arctic conditions did not get scurvy. Naval doctors noted this, then set it aside. Those people ate raw fresh meat, and raw fresh meat was not compatible with a modern ship's provisions. Almroth Wright, one of the most respected medical researchers of the era, proposed instead that scurvy was a form of acid intoxication, a buildup of metabolic poisons that the lime juice was supposed to neutralize as a base compound. When the lime juice failed, he assumed the theory needed refinement, not replacement. The disease had been mechanically prevented for over a century. Now, without knowing why it had worked, nobody could see why it had stopped. By 1900, British naval medicine was further from understanding scurvy than it had been when James Lind ran his trial on HMS Salisbury in 1747. The cure existed. They had discarded it. And another expedition was already being planned. In January of 1902, Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery expedition was pushing deep into the Antarctic interior. The men had been on the ice for months. Edward Wilson, the expedition's doctor, started watching their gums. They were swelling, then bleeding. Then the men's old healed wounds began to reopen, as if the ice were reaching back through time and undoing them. Their legs darkened. Their teeth shifted in their mouths. Wilson recognized it immediately. What the Navy had spent 20 years explaining away, Wilson saw in plain sight on the bodies of British sailors in the 20th century. Shackleton was among the worst cases. His gums were blackened, his legs swollen, his body failing at 30 years old. Wilson did the one thing that made logical sense to him, even though he could not have told you the chemistry behind it. He forced fresh seal meat into the diet. The men got better. Not immediately, but steadily. The seal meat was doing something the tinned provisions and the lime juice were not. Wilson filed this away, but he couldn't explain it. Nobody could. The prevailing theory said scurvy was caused by tainted food, by ptomaine poisoning in the canned rations. Fresh seal meat solved the problem, but the theory said it should have been irrelevant, so the lesson came through garbled. What Wilson actually learned was that fresh meat cured scurvy. What the expedition records suggested, filtered through existing assumptions, was that fresh food simply replaced the contaminated canned food and removed the poison source. Scott took that lesson south again in 1911. His rations for the polar journey were built around the tainted food theory. The quantities of fresh seal and penguin available at base camp were treated as supplementary, not essential. When the final polar party pushed for the pole, they were not carrying what their bodies required. They were carrying what the theory said they needed. 160 years after James Lind had handed the Navy the answer on a ship in the English Channel, the disease was still winning. Not because the cure was unknown, because nobody could explain why it worked, and without an explanation, nobody would bet their men's lives on it. Scott was already betting his. In 1907, in Oslo, Axel Holst and Theodor Froelich were not trying to solve scurvy. They were trying to understand a disease that was killing Norwegian sailors on grain ships. They chose guinea pigs as their test animals almost by accident. Standard lab stock, cheap, and easy to handle. That accident changed everything. Most mammals make their own vitamin C. Rats, mice, dogs, nearly all of them synthesize it internally and cannot get scurvy no matter what you feed them. Guinea pigs cannot. They share this defect with humans and with almost nothing else on Earth. When Holst and Froelich fed their guinea pigs the same grain rations the sailors were eating, the animals developed scurvy. Reproducibly. Every time. For the first time in history, a scientist could cause and cure the disease in a controlled laboratory setting. That was the deficiency disease idea being born in real time, not a poison causing the illness, the absence of something causing it. The distinction sounds simple now. In 1907, it was a revolution. But knowing that something was missing was not the same as knowing what it was. That took another 25 years. Albert Szent-Györgyi, a Hungarian biochemist, had been isolating a curious compound from adrenal glands and citrus since 1928. He called it hexuronic acid. He knew it was biologically active. He did not know what it did. In 1932, Charles Glenn King at the University of Pittsburgh proved that hexuronic acid was the anti-scurvy factor the whole world had been chasing. The compound was renamed ascorbic acid. Nobel Prize, 1937. The molecule explained everything retroactively. Why limes worked, though imperfectly. They had some. Why boiling destroyed the cure, heat degrades ascorbic acid. Why copper pipes made it worse. Copper accelerates that degradation. Why fresh seal meat saved Scots men when the lime juice failed. Every clinical observation across 180 years of sailors dying snapped into focus at once. And here was what mattered most. Once you had the molecule, you could synthesize it. You could measure it. You could put a number on a ration and know whether it was enough. The answer stopped being able to disappear into theory. It was a crystal in a jar. Scott never got that answer in time. But the next question is whether anyone around him tried to find it. The Royal Navy's own records show the number, if you know where to look. In the 7 Years' War alone, the Navy lost roughly 100,000 men to disease and desertion against fewer than 2,000 killed in combat. Scurvy was not the only killer, but it was the systematic one, the one that scaled with voyage length, the one that could be turned off. It wasn't turned off. Not for another 40 years after Lynn proved it could be. That is the thing about Lynn's trial on the Salisbury in 1747. It was real science, careful and controlled, producing a real result. But Lind himself buried his own finding inside a theory about moisture and putrefaction. The treatment survived. The explanation did not. And when the explanation collapsed under scrutiny, it took the treatment with it. This is what happens when correct evidence is attached to a wrong mechanism. The evidence becomes as fragile as the theory holding it up. Every step in the chain after Lind followed the same pattern. Each decision, the boiling of lime juice, the substitution of cheaper fruit, the shift from Mediterranean limes to West Indian ones, was rational inside the framework the decision maker was using. The framework was wrong. The men paid for that in collagen, in teeth, in hemorrhages beneath the skin. Tens of thousands of them, in the Royal Navy alone, across the century between Lind's trial and the discovery of what scurvy actually was. Here is the modern shape of that problem. In every institution that has ever run long enough, There are procedures that survive after the reasons for them have been forgotten. Someone still follows the step. Nobody can explain it. When a cost cutter looks at the ledger and sees an unexplained expense, the expense goes. The lime juice was on the ledger. The bottle was on the shelf. The men were still dying. Not because anyone was stupid, because correct knowledge, stripped of its mechanism, cannot defend itself. It just quietly disappears, and the dying starts again, and nobody connects the two until someone finally asks why.